I now recognize Mr. Borelli for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green and Ranking Member Thompson. Let me start with a blunt quote. The migrant crisis will destroy New York City. Those aren't my words. They aren't the words of extreme MAGA members or right-wing hyperbole. Those are the words spoken by Democratic New York City Mayor Eric Adams at a town hall in Manhattan 2 weeks ago. Though Mayor Adams and I disagree on many things, including how the city has managed the massive influx of migrants to our city, I'll give him credit for being the virtually only elected official in his own party to say out loud, repeatedly and in public, that the open border policies of this White House, Secretary Mayorkas, and the federal agencies under their control have been an absolute disaster for New York. And the people of my city are paying for it. The numbers are staggering. More than 125,000 migrants have flooded into New York City over the past 18 months. On average, about 60,000 individual migrants remain in our city's care each night, according to the latest statistics. Based on the current rate of about 9,000 migrants each month, the city expects to shelter over 78,000 individuals in the current fiscal year at a cost of $4.7 billion. By next fiscal year, assuming no action is taken by the federal government and New York doesn't amend its own policies, the city anticipates the average daily number of migrants in shelters could be more than 100,000 at a cost of $6.1 billion in that fiscal year. Adding the approximately $1.5 billion we have already spent, the total projected cost of sheltering migrants in New York City will exceed $12 billion over 3 fiscal years. To put that in perspective, over the next year alone, we will spend enough money to cover the entire budget of Dallas, Texas, meaning for the cost of sheltering migrants, New York City taxpayers could pay to man every firehouse, police station, pick up the garbage, maintain the water and sewers, inspect the buildings, run the airport, and even cut the grass in Dallas parks, a city of 1.3 million people. Over the next 2 years, we can do the same for both Philadelphia and Phoenix as well. These enormous costs are being borne almost entirely by the taxpayers of New York City. The Biden administration recently touted that they have provided $140 million in aid to reimburse the city for this crisis. This represents, at best, 1% of the projected cost. Incredibly, despite the crisis being caused by federal inaction at the border, the U.S. Department of the Interior is charging the city $21 million, plus tens of millions more in management fees and capital improvements, to lease Floyd Bennett Field, a historic National Park Service site. New Yorkers are essentially now paying for the loss of their public federal parkland. Returning to the $140 million already earmarked, the city spent double that on migrants in July alone. So at the current burn rate of about $10 million per day, federal aid would pay for about 2 weeks of sheltering migrants in New York City. Since the Department of Interior is now allowing national parks to be alienated to house migrants, perhaps it's time for the federal government to open shelter sites in national parks in other states and cities with lower costs, and where local elected officials have similarly declared sanctuary jurisdictions. These unanticipated and unsustainable expenses are the reason our mayor is preparing to possibly cut the city budget by a total of 15% by next spring. That could amount to roughly $16 billion in savings. To give another comparison, that is more than all the revenue generated by the government of Venezuela, a country from which many of these migrants have fled. These cuts could have devastating and far-reaching real-world consequences, affecting every essential service the city must provide, from keeping communities safe and our streets clean to educating children and maintaining critical infrastructure, perhaps even requiring layoffs. This would ultimately wreak havoc on New York's economy, which has yet to recover from the pandemic recession. Right now, almost every community in our city is on edge, fearing the next migrant shelter will be in their backyard, worrying about how this growing crisis will affect every aspect of life in New York. They are right to be alarmed, and unless we reverse the disastrous policy decisions that have brought us to this point on both the local and federal level, there will be no end in sight, and this migrant crisis eventually will destroy New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Borelli. I stayed in Dallas the other day. It was like $200 for just a regular room in Dallas. It's $150 at an ICE detention bed. Why don't we put people in an ICE detention bed? I mean, maybe, Mr. Borelli, you can kind of talk about the difference between the empty ICE detention beds and the hundreds of dollars for these hotels where we're putting people.
Sure. I mean, one hotel in New York, the Roosevelt Hotel, the cost that the city is leasing it for is $200 per night, which is actually a discounted rate, it seems. There's 1,000 rooms, so that's $20 million per month, roughly, to pay for that one site. And there's 206 sites being used with similar costs. So, yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful. I think this is one of those areas where Mayor Adams and I would agree that it would be wonderful if some other sanctuary cities around the country would pick up the tabs, especially where there are cheaper hotels available.
Can you talk a little bit about education services to illegal aliens and what that's costing the city?
Sure. The cost per student in New York is about $38,000 per student. So we've seen about 20,000 children related to the migrant crisis enter our schools. Now, we have available space in many school buildings around the city. However, where we see the concentrations of hotels is also where we see the concentration of migrant shelters. So when you look at a very small neighborhood, you might have vast overcrowding in certain schools while the school down the block might be available. The impossibility is that folks are coming in 5, 6, 7,000 a month, and even on our best day, the good people of the Department of Education can't figure out how to sort and place these students. Now, the DOE just added $110 million to hire more language-specific teachers and teachers qualified for ESL, but that's $110 million that we were not expecting to spend.
So the information you have provided to us says that New York will spend next year almost as much money as the entire state of Mississippi spends to fund our entire state government. You talk about that there are anticipated expense cuts that are coming. You say that there are unanticipated and unsustainable expenses, that the reason the mayor's preparing to cut the city's budget by a total of 15%. You go on to talk about effective services, public safety, education, critical infrastructure, and possible layoffs. So I want to ask you, Ms. Borelli, first and foremost, do you agree with the statement of Mayor Adams that we just played here just moments ago?
I do. I think it has the potential to really diminish New York City's long-term financial future. I think it's a major problem. I wouldn't bet against us. You know, New York has come back before. I just don't know whether it'll be in my generation or perhaps the next generation. But yes, it would be correct to compare it to the budget of Mississippi, and I'm actually looking forward to visiting your state for the first time next month, so I'll see what that $6 billion buys your taxpayers. For us, it pays for these potential, at that point in the next fiscal year, about 78,000 migrants. And again, the mayor's cost estimate per day, per person, is about $383, so obviously that will continue to increase as long as buses are being sent from the border.
And Ms. Borelli, who do you blame for the current financial crisis that's being caused by the illegal immigration there in New York?
I blame the federal government. I mean, we have had, and I'll accept responsibility for not being able to push back against sanctuary city policies and the right to shelter policy in my city, but at the same time, we've had those in place since the 1980s. It's only been since this administration has took over, it's only been since Secretary Mayorkas has taken over, where we have had this level of unprecedented migration to our cities from people who are relying on the city taxpayer to provide every resource available to them.
And Ms. Borelli, you state there in your testimony, you say the open border policies of this White House, Secretary Mayorkas, and the federal agencies under their control have been an absolute disaster for New York. And so in the last few seconds of my time, I would like to give you the opportunity to address the President, Secretary Mayorkas, members of their staff who are likely watching this, and give you the opportunity to deliver a message. The message I would have to them would be secure the damn border. But I want you to have the opportunity in the last closing seconds to deliver a message to the Secretary in the White House.
Well, I'm a guest, so I wouldn't use four-letter words. So I would tell the President to close the border. And as a New Yorker, I'd tell the President to give us a bit more money to help with the crisis. Thank you. No, I've never seen a situation where New York City or any other municipality that I have direct knowledge of has paid this amount of money for services provided to people who have crossed the border. That's not happened. And during the Trump
Can I interrupt you for a second, sir? Very respectfully, I'm going to ask the question again. Based on your collective knowledge and experience, can you share how the Trump administration's zero policy caused irreparable harm to young children and vulnerable families? Not New York City, we're just talking in general.
Sure. Well, my godson's mother emigrated to this country during the Trump administration. There were plenty of my neighbors who were admitted to this country during the Trump administration. Plenty of people got citizenship. There were tens of thousands of people who received asylum status during that administration. Again, though, what I have not seen in the difference between this administration and, frankly, the Trump administration and, frankly, the Obama administration was the sheer lack of resources and mass migration placed on America's cities.
So, and I'm going to go back to, as I queried the other member, do you think the problems are 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old? Because it appears from the testimony that this has somehow become an administration versus administration instead of an earnest attempt to find a solution. You know, the blame game, it won't solve the issues for the American people. What will solve the issues for the American people are honest discussions on how we can get better. And the assumption that somehow these problems began with the Biden administration is disingenuous at best.
I think it's fair and accurate to say that since the administration changed its policy on Remain in Mexico, since the changes in tactics and duties of border and custom agents, we just have a different scenario than we had in previous administrations. Again, I'm a New Yorker. There have been people who came to our city who are undocumented for as long as I can remember. But we have never had a crisis where 206 shelters are being placed willy-nilly in neighborhoods far and wide. We've simply never had that. We used to fight over homeless shelters like every city I'm sure you represent, where they go. They're controversial. People tend not to like living next to them. Now, seemingly overnight, in 1 year's time, we've placed 206 shelters.
I've got about 55 seconds. Real quickly, do you believe, yes or no, do you believe that individuals, families, and children deserve humane treatment?
100%.
Thank you.
Mr. Borelli, how many migrants are there now in New York City, newly arrived migrants, due to the border crisis?
In our care, about 62,000 that have come since the crisis began, about 125,000.
And when the number that you gave that it's going to cost New York City, what's that based on? What number is that based on?
That's based on the accumulation of various services that are offered, everything from housing.
Not the services, the number of people. How many people are you talking about?
That is what the Mayor Adams administration is estimating based on the number of people that are disembarking at bus terminals, Port Authority bus terminal, or that present themselves at migrant intake shelters.
Okay, so, but there's a number attached to that. And what's that number?
125,000 overall.
125,000, and how much is the cost?
383 per person per day.
Which is how much per year?
To be clear, some of those people have transitioned out of shelters, but the cost per year next year will be about 6.1 to 6.5 billion.
$6.1 billion.
Correct.
For 125,000 people? A steady number of 125,000 people?
Correct.
All right, so in terms of their time to get a court date, anybody know how long, what's the average time to get a court date now for a migrant coming through?
We have seen people with 20, 33 court dates, meaning the lawyers will probably at Little League tonight. That'll be their attorney in that case in 10 years.
Thank you.
I want to make sure that I heard you correctly, Mr. Lyons and Councilman Borelli. Should municipalities, is it fair for municipalities to bear the full cost of food and shelter and other emergency expenses related to migration? Is it fair that those costs be borne by the municipalities exclusively?
No. No, I mean, I think it's caused by the federal government.
So it's not fair for municipalities to bear the cost.
Mr. Borelli, I have a couple of quotes that I want to read to you, and let me know if you know who said them. First, quote, "Migrants get more attention and resources than any other group in the city, and we are just turning New York into the world's refugee camp." Do you know who said that?
Well, that sounds like me.
It was. Next, quote, they seem to be on the whole an honest class, but they are continually brought before the courts for fighting, violence, and attempts at murder, crimes which arise from the crowded way in which they live and the jealousies and quarrels that would naturally arise from such a promiscuous mode of life. But the children, as they grow up, will naturally and inevitably form the criminal class of this city. Do you know what group of newly arrived immigrants that this quote referred to?
I would say 19th century immigrants, Italy, Ireland, maybe.
Italians. It's from an 1882 New York Times editorial about Italian immigrants coming to New York City, which were sadly reflective of a really disgusting common sentiment at the time. And you're a member of New York City Council's Italian caucus, right? Right?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree with that assessment of Italians as forming the criminal class of New York City?
No, sir.
And you have been fear-mongering on this issue, as have my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, about the, quote, criminals coming across the border. But you are aware, are you not, Mr. Borelli, that the amount of crime from the migrants who have arrived in New York City is far lower than the average crime rate in the city, correct?
I'm unaware, but I'll assume since you're saying it in public, it's true. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I have a bunch I want to get through. And I think, one of the things that frustrates us on this side of the aisle in New York City about some of your rhetoric, and I represent the district that includes the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. My grandmother escaped anti-Semitism to come through Ellis Island, as so many of our forefathers did. The Statue of Liberty states, quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And that is the New York way. New York City has always welcomed immigrants. Immigrants are what make that city the most dynamic in the country and have built its success. And we must welcome immigrants that are fleeing horrific conditions in their countries, in Central and South America. And I applaud the Biden administration for announcing a reinvestment into those countries to stabilize them and improve their economies. In your opening statement, you identify a lot of problems that we have, Mr. Borelli. Very few solutions. But I want to ask you a couple questions about some solutions. You noted one of the migrants has an asylum date of 2033. You would agree that part of the problem that we have are asylum delays. Is that right? Expediting court cases would be helpful, correct.
And would it be helpful to have more immigration judges to help expedite that backlog?
I assume part of that problem is the lack of judges.
Yeah. You've talked about, and we've all talked about, the problem with fentanyl and the cartels. In fact, my colleague from Texas just say that the cartels control the border and control the fentanyl trade. You would agree, would you not, that if the cartels did not have weapons of war, they would have less control over the border? Is that correct?
I don't know how they have control in Mexico, but I just met with the Office of Special...
So are you aware that they have a lot of guns?
The majority of the deaths in my district of drugs have trace amounts of fentanyl in it.
Right. So fentanyl's a problem, controlled, as my colleagues say, by the cartels, who have as much as 90% of their guns come from America. You would agree more visas, lawful visas, would help, right? More than 50% of Fortune 500 CEOs are either immigrants or children of immigrants. If we had more lawful visas, that would reduce the amount of immigration coming across our border. And then finally, I just want to ask, the business community in New York City, as I'm sure you know, has come out in favor of granting migrants work authorization, right? Do you agree with that?
Work authorizations are certainly part of the solution, but it's unclear why we would have to prioritize people for work authorizations who have not followed the law thus far.
We don't need to prioritize it, but would you agree that those... Would you agree... My last question, sir. Would you agree that the 180-day waiting period should be reduced after someone applies for asylum to get a work authorization?
I would agree that there are work authorizations that could be granted for the thousands of people that you and I both represent, who have families waiting overseas, who have to date applied and follow over
Exactly.
those
The business,
hired
and
attorneys.
just if I could wrap up, because
And-
my time's
and
almost
they're waiting.
over. And
you
that
want
is
them to
correct.
get
The
the line.
business community wants people to work, and we want people to work. Every single one of those proposals I just mentioned are Democratic legislative proposals. None of them are included in H.R. 2 or any Republican proposals because they're not interested in solving the problem. They're interested in starving our border, starving our Department of Homeland Security so that it continues to fail for their political benefit.
From low-income Americans to accommodate the illegal aliens arriving into the city?
Yes and no. It's not necessarily a reduction in spending, but it is a reduction in space. We have a homeless shelter